Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the East-West Center in Washington. And I know some folks are still getting food, and folks will come in, and some people are live on the camera now watching as well. So welcome to all of you. Delighted to have Dr. Selina Ho here today from the National University of Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Selina and I met some years ago. I can't recall exactly when, because of her shared interest in issues of rivers and water management in the region. And now she has and congratulations to you, Selina, you now have a wonderful new book from Cambridge called Thirsty Cities, Social Contracts and Public Goods Provision in China and India, which sort of goes into the question of how China and India comparatively provide water resources to their urban centers, how to think about that, and of course in the larger scheme of things, aside from using this work, it looks at the issue of how China and India deliver goods to their public citizens, and so it raises all kinds of questions about regimes and what are the key variables. But Selina has graciously agreed to talk about her new book, which has just been released, and I would note for you, there's a flyer and the discount applies till July 31st. Right. So order today. And I don't get any profits or cut from highlighting the book. But I do think it's of great interest. And Selina said she'd have a PowerPoint about 45 minutes and explain her case in the book. And then we can move to Q&A. I would just remind everyone in the room that today we are on the record and are live streaming the video of this program, just so you are aware. But with that, let me welcome Selina, and thank you for coming and doing this program, and take it away, your show.
Thank you, Santu. This is my second time at the East-West Center. I actually did one maybe about 3 years back on water issues. In that case, that water issue was about river water issues, right? And so thank you, Satu, and your team for very kindly arranging this book talk. So my book's just been out in April, as Satu said, and it looks at the issue of public goods in China and India. It's a comparative study, and it focuses on one particular type of public good, and that is the urban water sector, which is the kind of water that you actually get, in your home from the tap. Things that we don't really think about, but which is actually essential for survival. Let me give a rundown on what are the kinds of things we're going to cover today. I will start, by explaining why we should study public goods, why is it important, and then the research puzzle with the research question, and then we talk a little bit about the existing theories on public goods provision, and then my argument. Right? My argument is basically the idea of a social contract between the government and its people. Is an informal institution, and that, I'm arguing, determines the level of public goods provision in a country. I will explain what is a social contract, and then how is that applied in China's context, and how is that applied in India's context. And then I'll zoom in on 2 case studies in that time period indicated on the slide. I actually have 4 cases inside this book, 2 from India and 2 from China. And basically they cover first-tier cities. Okay, so on the Chinese side, I have Shenzhen and Beijing. And in the Indian side, I have Delhi and Hyderabad. In this presentation, I'm just going to focus on two cities, Shenzhen and Hyderabad, in the interest of time. And then later on, I'll round up with some policy implications, not just for China and India, but about the issue of public goods provision in the United States as well. Okay? So let's start with some quotes. You have Confucius here, talking about, he didn't really call them public goods, but it is about public goods. He said, I've heard that a nation or a family does not worry that it has little, but that little is unevenly apportioned, does not worry that it's poor, but that it's unstable. Because with equitable distribution, there is no real poverty. With harmony, no real scarcity. With stability, no real peril. So as you can see from this quote, the way the ancient Chinese think about public goods provision is that it's essential for stability and the survival of the regime. There is the idea that it's about equitable distribution of goods in society. And then you have Autonomy, who wrote a really interesting book on India, and which I use extensively in my own book. He said that next to making war, redistributive reform is probably the most difficult task a state can undertake. So basically, if you really want to understand how states function, how effective they are, it's not just about war, which is the most difficult task, but that you can actually see the state in action when you look at how they provide public goods. That will tell you a lot about how well the state is functioning. So this is my puzzle. All right, I'm going to show two pictures. Can everyone see it? Is it too small?
No, I think we can see it.
So what is this? In India somewhere?
Where?
Sorry?
Where?
In India? Okay. Somewhere?
A public well.
Yeah, and so a hand pump. Okay, the reason why in India that it's a common sight to see all these hand pumps is because India households receive water only for 2 to 3 hours a day. So what you find is that people look for private solutions. So if you have money, if you are rich and you are middle class, you will look at buying filtration systems. You'll look at water storage tanks. Okay, so you buy water from what is known as the water mafia. Okay, private vendors that goes around providing water in tankers. Okay, so this is what happens in India. But then what happens to the people who are poor? People who are living in slums? They actually need to rely a lot on these hand pumps. Now let's have another look at this picture. Well, this looks like a Chinese girl. Okay, it looks almost like a commercial. And clean water in a glass. In the background, you have pipes and a sink. Okay, China actually has continuous water being supplied into every residential household, almost 100% in major cities. Okay, so the question then, therefore, is why is authoritarian China better at delivering public goods than democratic India? The assumption always is that democracies produce more public goods. I'll talk about that a bit more when I talk about what are the theories that are out there about public goods provision. So let me continue with the puzzle. Now, one way to look at the how well a government is performing in terms of providing public goods, which is like it can be about health, it can be about education, is to look at Human Development Index. Okay, so the Human Development Index actually focuses on measuring expected years of schooling, expected years of life, and things like that. So this is a chart that goes from 1980 to 2013. In case it's too small for you to read. The brown ones are India. The orange one is China. So as you can see, they kind of start off somewhere in 1980, around the same point. But China has grown quite a bit, and the gap between them has actually also grown quite a bit. In the 10-year period, 1980 to 2013, on the HDI index, China's ranking actually jumped 10 places. India's ranking jumped just 1 place. So that tells you the progress that China has made in terms of producing public goods. India has been lagging behind for quite some time. And then you have, so why, of all the categories of public goods, why am I looking at the Indian urban water sector or Chinese water, the urban water sector in general? One of the important things is that we define public goods. Public goods is non-rigorous and non-excludable. So if we think about that, then we can come up with three categories of public goods. One is basic amenities and services. Okay, so water will go into it. Okay, water, electricity, things like that will go into this first category. This first category will be considered the least excludable and the least rigorous. You can't really, don't provide water to people. Okay, it's basic. Now, the second category is foodstuff, and the third one is benefits. Benefits will entail things like healthcare, medicine, pensions, retirement benefits of that sort, which actually, if you have more money, you can have better quality of benefits. So in a sense, that third category is more excludable and more rigorous. So in order to understand how states perform in this area, it is actually best to focus on the first category of basic goods and services, because it is least excludable, least rigorous, and therefore state intervention has to be high. Okay? So focusing on water for that purpose, and also because water is a critical issue for both countries who are, engines of growth. Water is becoming very important for them, and if water pollution issues are actually costing them percentages of GDP. Okay, so this is the Indian urban water sector. If you can see the performance of how they have performed. So the service level benchmarks, which is the first column, actually is set by the Ministry of Urban Development in India, and these are the things that they should be aiming for. And if you look at the next two columns, 2009 and 2011, you'll see that India is actually very far from hitting these targets. And in fact, if you look at the 2011 figures, it's actually kind of alarming, because there are no improvements. In fact, there are deterioration, okay, over the same period of time, except for two categories, which is the extent of non-revenue water, okay, meaning the water that's lost and revenue is not being collected. It actually went down, so the aim is to hit as low as possible. And the other one is the quality of water supply. It went up a little bit, okay, but the target is still 100% is still far away. Okay. And let's have a look at the Chinese urban water sector. Well, almost water coverage in urban areas is almost 100%, and water production is high. The proportion of water loss, this is a significant indicator that people are concerned about, because a lot of water actually gets lost in the process, and that really affects the amount of water that's actually available to residents at the end of the day. So it's very low for China. And it's the payment collection, water metering, those are generally pretty okay. Now, I just want to make clear before I go on that I'm not saying anything about China being perfect. China is far from, a welfare state, and China is far from being, in the Northern European sense. It's not. There are many problems. There are huge inequalities that are still there. There are problems struggling with pension system. They're struggling with that. So there are all these issues as well. It's not that it's perfect, but my question is relative. It's about relativity, okay? And I'm taking on the arguments that scholars have put on about regime types making a difference in public goods provision. So my argument is actually, captured in this really simple diagram. It's about the idea of a social contract as an informal institution, and how that actually impacts on institutional design. Whether institutions involved in public goods provision actually have autonomy and capacity, two qualities that Max Weber considered to be very important for a well-functioning bureaucracy. Now, before I go on to this, I just want to put it up there first. I want to talk about what are the existing theories on public goods provision. Now, the one that that most work have begun is that studies have attributed the variation in public goods provision to regime type. What type of regime? Okay. So, and they generally agree that democracies produce more public goods than authoritarian systems. The reason being, there are a few. This is based on rational choice arguments. So first is time horizons. Basically, the argument here is that democracies have longer time horizons, as opposed to autocrats or dictators, right? Because autocrats and dictators will want to keep, in the shortest period of time, keep as much rent for themselves as possible. Democracies, on the other hand, would want to stay in power through elections, winning elections, and so forth. So the time horizons is longer, and therefore they are more likely to want to produce more public goods for all citizens, as opposed to the rents that autocrats will capture for themselves and their core group supporters. So public goods will be more better. Now, the other argument that's been put forth is that of that democracies have large winning coalitions. This is based on the selectorate theory by Bruno de Mosquita, who is in New York University, and they run large statistical studies to produce kind of results. Again, the idea that in democracies the winning coalitions are large, therefore produce more public goods. The winning coalitions in dictatorships, in authoritarian systems are small, therefore less public goods are being produced. The third one, again, is about that elections act as a key institutional constraint in democracies. In authoritarian systems, there are no elections to speak of. Now, what is wrong with these regime-type explanations? First, you can see that as opposed to all these large statistical studies, there are all these cases where you can see some authoritarian systems that do produce high levels of public goods. One very good example will be the Gulf monarchies, right? The Gulf states have resources that actually change the incentives for producing public goods. Okay, and then you have democracies do not necessarily have longer time horizons because it goes on the electoral cycle. If you're going to anticipate that you're going to no longer going to be in power in the next electoral cycle, you might actually want to accumulate rents instead of trying to produce more public goods for everyone. The size of the main coalitions in democracies may be small. Now, this is where I'm going to draw it from the work of Barbara Getz on Latin America, where she actually talked about how the incentives that politicians actually have incentives to respond to only specific interests, those who are going to be politically useful supporters. Given limited resources, what these politicians will do will be to give rents to these groups that will help them win elections, and therefore public goods is going to be underproduced. Now, and the other thing is that elections are really not the only form of institutional constraint. There are a lot of other forms of institutional constraint, including, like in the United States, you have the separation of power. That's an institutional constraint. The role of the judiciary, for instance. But there are also what is known as a category of informal institutions. Informal institutions, which I will define in a bit, are codes of behavior, norms that that people will be guided by, and which they will not want to go against because there will be consequences for those. So other explanations of public goods and all that have focused on these three things: level of economic development, state capacity, and ethnicity. For in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on the first two, which is that you would imagine, right, a country that's richer, higher GDP, greater wealth, is likely to produce more public goods. I think that makes sense because they have greater resources, they can produce more public goods. But the truth of the matter is that countries which are wealthy also have large inequalities. That tells you that redistribution is not automatic. There's no direct causal linkage between wealth and public goods provision. There has to be something else between that. So you can think about state capacity as well. But state capacity, you can think of a predatory state. The predatory state has high state capacity. It's able to extract from resources from society, which means that goods are not going to be public goods are not going to be produced. Ethnicity, I will leave it out for now, but if you have questions about that, I'll be able to answer. So coming back to my argument, which is this: social contracts impact on institutional autonomy and capacity, leading to high or low levels of public goods provision. But first, let us ask, what is a social contract? So this is actually a cartoon that I drew, that I took from the internet. I think it's too small for you to read it, but this person on the left is saying, "You don't kill me, I will kill you." And the other guy on the right says, "Hey, sounds good." And it's agreed upon by a handshake. That sounds about right. You have a handshake. The handshake does represent that contract. We have agreement here. But actually, the social contract is more complicated than that. I draw from the works of Rousseau, from the works of Hobbes, and also from Locke about what is a social contract. These three traditional political philosophers actually look at the state of nature, okay, and then correspondingly, what kind of governments should be built. You have Hobbes with his Leviathan, okay, a government that is domineering and which covers everything, and you have Locke with the idea of limited government. Okay, but let me try and define social contract based on their works. Okay, so a social contract is an agreement between state and society in which citizens consent. Keyword here is consent to give up certain rights to the governments in exchange. This is a reciprocal relationship. It's an exchange relationship. For governments, obligation is also another keyword here, to provide for their people. And in this social contract, you actually need to have the basis of government legitimacy to align with what people expect of government. Okay, then you can see a social contract forming. Now let me go to the next stage. I go beyond what traditional philosophers have said. I actually define social contract as an informal institution. Now let us ask the question: what is institution, right? Institutions are rules of the game in a society, or more formally, the humanly devised constraints that shape human interaction. This is by Douglas North. And then he goes on to divide institutions into formal institutions, which are like constitutions, laws, policies, which you can actually, they're legal, okay? And then you have another category of institutions that is known as informal institutions. What are informal institutions? They are socially shared rules, usually unwritten, meaning there's no legal ratification, okay, and that they are created, communicated, and enforced outside of officially sanctioned channels. What are some examples of these? They are things like culture, traditions, customs, taboos, shared norms, codes of behavior. Things like if you're in an Asian household, you normally take off your shoes when you enter the household, or things like that. Okay, so a social contract. Why do I think of it as an informal institution? Now, it has many characteristics of an institution. What are these characteristics? So it shapes state and society relations, and they prescribe what is legitimate state behavior and what society expects from them. So it has this shaping function, okay, of interactions between state and society. And it constrains governments because there are punishments or sanctions. Institutions do that. Institutions constrain people or governments by with the threat of punishments and sanctions. So governments can be thrown out of power, either by losing elections, or they are, in a military coup, they are violently deposed of, okay, if they do not follow a social contract or an informal institution. There are repeated patterns of behavior that you can see when states and society observe this social contract. There's this repeated patterns of behavior. When that pattern of behavior keeps repeating, then you can see that there is that institution actually exists. And it's sticky. Okay, an institution is sticky and resistant to change. It's difficult to change. A social contract, okay, it's not impossible, but it's difficult. Now, why is it informal? Informal because it's unwritten, implicit, it's not legally binding, and does not require ratification by any legislative body. So if this, I define social contract as an informal institution, and but how do you know they exist? They exist when you look at the country's constitution. Okay, it's going to be reflected in there. The laws that a country draw up, the policies that are being put up, that were accord with the terms of the social contract, the official statements that government makes, and the political discourses and narratives that come out that refers to this social contract. So let's see how it's applied in China's case. So that ends the theoretical part of the thing. So I hope that doesn't bore people too much. But this is the more practical part, the empirical case studies that I'm looking at. So my argument here is that China's social contract actually produces strong institutional capacity and autonomy for the production of high level public goods. So what is actually in China's social contract? What is in it? So the main features of China's social contract is that it is based first of all on performance. This is what I will call a performance-based social contract. And this is not only in material terms. Performance not only in producing material goods, in achieving high levels of economic growth, but there's actually a normative element to it. What is this normative element? So this normative element is what is most has been in existence since historical time. It's known as the mandate of heaven. I'm sure some of you have heard of it. The idea of the mandate of heaven has to do with the idea that one has a right to rule when one is benevolent and one provides for its people. So officials in historic times in China are being judged based on this standard. That if you have to be morally upright, you have to be benevolent, you have to ensure that your people are provided for. The idea of public goods is there. This historical concept, this ancient concept of mandate of heaven, is actually being carried forward now. The CCP regime is still in existence because every now and then you will hear that whenever there was an earthquake, like the Sichuan earthquake in China, someone would say, oh, the CCP has lost the mandate of heaven to rule. The mandate of heaven is still a relevant concept, and the Chinese leadership adheres to it very carefully. The idea that of anti-corruption, okay, that is part of this idea of performance, that there is a moral element to performance. Chinese officials are being judged based on a few things. They're being assessed on a few things. First, by how well the economies perform, the local economies perform, by whether there is stability in the provinces that they govern, and also in the anti-corruption campaign. Okay? And Xi Jinping has launched when he came into power, launched the most comprehensive anti-corruption campaign. That has a lot to do with morality, keeping the CCP party moral, okay, in order to fulfill this social contract. And the interesting thing about the Chinese social contracts is that there is actually an urban bias to it. This is because large cities, like what you find in China, actually concentrate dense populations, which means that they become centers of collective action. So if there are large-scale protests and instability, that will impact on the regime. So when the CCP came into power after 1949, one of the first things they did was they ensured that Chinese workers, have access to a whole range of public goods in the cities. So this is manifested in two ways. One is that the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises that workers work for, is actually providing cradle-to-grave kind of benefits for the workers in these enterprises. The other one is the hukou system, which is the household responsibility system, meaning that you are registered in a particular city, and if you're not born in the city, you have difficulties gaining access to the public amenities and the services there. Schools for your kids, you cannot get into good schools. Okay, so there's an urban bias in that social contract. Now, how does that translate into the impact on the second box, which is the institutional design? Well, the emphasis on performance actually grants institutions extensive rights and autonomy. That is in the area of space. So you'll find that in China, government bureaucracies are actually not unduly influenced by societal interference. There's very little that society can do. I mean, there are protests, there are unhappiness, but there are limits to what they can do. Primarily, the idea is that the concept of rights, human rights, or the concept of individual rights, or the concept of citizen rights actually do not exist in China. Okay. Traditionally, there is no concept of this right. What you have, so it's not a legal obligation, as in other countries, what happens is that, but then the idea of a benevolent king means that the state is obliged, but it is not something that citizens can demand legally from the state, right? So there's a difference here. There is a right for legal demand and a right of expectation, but only because the state, you are expected to be benevolent, and therefore the expectation is that if you are moral, you will provide for me. It's a gift from the government. It is not a legal right. Welfare benefits is not a legal right, but a gift from the government, from a benevolent government. So this gives institutions in China a lot of space from societal interference and demands. At the same time, the emphasis on performance actually means that the Chinese state needs to devote resources to the construction of infrastructure and public works. This is necessary for economic growth, it's necessary for the well-being of the people. So you'll find that resources in terms of funding, in terms of ways to raise money, are being poured into local governments, which is actually the story that we're telling here, the local governments. So how does this story play out in Shenzhen? How does it play out in Shenzhen? So we're looking at the period between in the 1990s to the early 2000s, okay? There are important changes that took place during that time. China's social contract actually leads to institutional autonomy and capacity. Now, if everyone remember when Deng Xiaoping opened up the country to reforms and to economic growth, one of the first things he did was to create social economic zones. So Shenzhen in 1979 was made an SEZ, which gives it tremendous rights and autonomy and authority to run its economy according to local features, local needs. So when Shenzhen was designated a SEZ with all sorts of rights, okay, and one of its greatest rights is that it was given the autonomy to set laws and regulations on its own that fits its local context, okay. And in the process, is relevant to the urban water sector itself. In 1993, an independent water authority, the Shenzhen Water Affairs Bureau, was set up. I'll talk about this bureau in a little bit. And there was a lot of operational autonomy that's given to the urban water sector as well, because when there's a separation of government and enterprise. Okay, so Shenzhen Water Group was a very large SOE. Okay, but in 2004 it became a joint venture between Beijing Capital and the French Veolia. Okay, an water multinational company, and at that time it was one of the largest mergers and acquisitions during that period of time. When this happened, the Shenzhen government became a regulator. It stopped being part of the enterprise. So this is what I mean by separation of government and enterprise. So Shenzhen Water Group became independent on its own. Well, in terms of resource allocation, during this period, you will see the government actually quadrupled investment in the urban water sector from 2005 to 2009. So what is the impact of institutional autonomy and capacity in Shenzhen on the urban water sector itself? First, you'll see that there's actually greater efficiency and coordination among the disparate bodies of government agencies that's in charge of water. So before the Shenzhen Water Affairs Bureau was formed, water functions were spread out across different ministries. It created a situation in which the Chinese call it 九龙治水, which means 9 dragons, basically 9 ministries or agencies administrating the water sector. So what the Shenzhen Water Affairs Bureau did was that it pulled together all these functions. It was streamlined, and there was integrated water management. And as a result of which, it was actually praised by the ADB as a model for reform of urban water management. This is the report, Good Practices in Urban Water Management, that the ADB produced, which looks at case studies across the world, and in Shenzhen was featured as one of the case studies and was praised as a model. Okay, and there was also strengthened regulation and oversight, which I've mentioned before. The Shenzhen government became the regulator, okay, and Shenzhen actually came up with a relatively complete legal framework for water management. So there are more than 20 water policies and laws that were set up in Shenzhen. And you can see this from the improved performance of the Shenzhen Water Group itself, the company itself. They work based on the principle of breaking even and having a low profit. So they actually are able to reinvest into infrastructures to ensure that water delivery continues to be good, and they are able to expand operations outside Shenzhen. In fact, they have operations in 7 provinces outside of Shenzhen itself. So, and then in the end, what you see is improved performance of the water sector. Water production rose from 622,000 cubic meters in 1991 to 2.58 million cubic meters in 1995. And the water supply per capita per day is higher than the national average, and the water loss is very low, below the national average. So you have three lines here. Shenzhen is Shenzhen actually has the darkest line, okay? So, and then the orange one in the middle is the national average, and the yellow one is from Beijing. You'll see that they maintain a very low proportion of water loss, and after some time, Beijing has always been below the national average, and in the year around this period of time, the water loss for Shenzhen actually went down the national average as well. So, what is the side? What is the side of the story for India? What is the narrative there? So India's social contract, I would say, comprises 3 characteristics. One is socialism, okay. The other is populism, and the third one is rural bias. So instead of urban bias, there's a rural bias in the Indian social contract. Now, socialism, when Nehru came into power, he was actually a socialist. He wanted to create a socialist state. And there are 2 aspects of socialism that were stressed when he came into power. One is state ownership. Okay, so what he did was, or businesses. So what he did was he nationalized the key industries, the strategic industries. India was supposed to have a mixed economy, and it is a mixed economy, but with a heavy emphasis on the public sector, on the state sector. And the other thing that Nehru wanted was a welfare state, the creation of a welfare state. Okay? But the creation of a welfare state is actually a lot harder to achieve, and as a result of which we see things devolving into populism, where the idea of free electricity, free water comes about. The free water, free electricity is a kind of slogans that politicians use in India during election time. So populism, according to some Indian scholars, actually came about in India as a result of imposing a democratic form of government on top of a pre-industrial society, meaning that the industrial revolution have not come into India when democracy arrived. Okay, so it's still an agrarian society. So what does that mean for politics? It means that all the traditional patronage systems and networks that were at the rural level, at the bottom level, actually rose up to the level of the state and the national level when it comes to elections. All these traditional patronage networks all rise. Okay, and these patronage networks actually is split in according to ethnic, religious, linguistic lines. So it is very fractious and divisive. And this, as a result of it, you see very charismatic leaders emerging. They pull power to themselves, personalize power, and they advocate for the poor against the elites. Okay, and then they will bypass institutions. Okay, that is damaging for institutions. Now that slogan, that roti kapda aur makan, meaning food, clothing, shelter, has been popularized by Indira Gandhi. Okay, so populism is actually something that Indira Gandhi brought into the Indian political system in the 1950s and 1960s, and this became entrenched in Indian politics. Oh, there is a rural bias in this social contract, primarily because India is largely agrarian. To this day, it's a 69, 31, 31% of the population is urban, 69% is rural. And there's a rural bias, and it's shown, it is manifested in the loans that are given to farmers, the subsidies that are given to them, as well as high agricultural prices. So as I mentioned before, socialism emphasizes state ownership and central planning, and that also have one effect, which is that it results in a very strong central government vis-a-vis local governments, as a result of which local governments do not have the resources to, and neither do they have the space, the independence, to carry out policies on their own. So institutions are at the local level are weak, okay, and they are also not very autonomous. They become captured to traditional. They are captured by traditional political patronage, and they are beholden to special groups in societies as well, and political interests. The other one is populism. It weakens institutions. Populist leaders usually bypass institutions. They accumulate power for themselves. So it narrows the space between institutions and political and societal interests, and it also diverts resources to those that support the particular leader, such that public goods are not that well spread out throughout society. So let's look at what happened to Hyderabad. Right? This man, has anyone heard of him? Yes. I do. He's very famous, right? So he has a wonderful vision for Hyderabad. He's known for that, to make Hyderabad like a high-tech state. Okay? And he was in power twice. Okay, between the years of 1995 to 2004, he's the chief minister of Andhra Pradesh. Okay, which has now been bifurcated. So this story took place before the bifurcation of Andhra Pradesh in 2014. And so he's known to have gender-based tendencies. He says, this is a slogan from him: society is our temple, people are our gods, people first is our mantra. You can't get any more populist than this, if you say that people are our gods. Okay, so this is Naidu, okay, a very forward-looking man. He has gender-based tendencies in the sense that he actually has all the. When I say he was a forward-looking man, in the sense that he actually wants to implement tough economic policies. He wants to cut subsidies. He wants to grow Hyderabad into a high-tech state. But he's being constrained by the social contract. In what way? He actually needs to downplay his tough economic policies, his tough economic reforms. Instead, what he does is that he actually, talk about and trumpet his welfare policies all the time. Okay, so he hide. That's a very common thing for Indian politicians to do. They hide the tough economic policies, and they talk about free water, free electricity all the time. So what happened is that the India social contract actually constrains and modifies the behavior and policies of leaders who want to make changes. They cannot because of this populist concept. And so to mitigate it against the loss of power, politicians actually backtracked a lot of policies. Rajiv Gandhi did that. Rajiv Gandhi wanted to reform the automobile industry, but he was forced to roll it back as a result of populist anger. So in the case of Hyderabad, what we are actually focusing on, or what I'm actually focusing on in my book, is the reforms that were taking place in the Hyderabad Metropolitan Water Supply and Sewage Board. So this is a public utility. It was formed in 1989, okay, and there is a board of directors. Okay, the chairman is actually the chief minister, meaning Naidu is the chairman of the board. And the board of the members are actually political appointees. Okay. So, and the government of Andhra Pradesh actually own all of the HMWSSB's assets, meaning that actually the HMWSSB has very little limited autonomy. It's beholden to a set of political interests. Okay. So, what Naidu tried to do when he came into power in 1995, the first time round, he tried to reform. He wanted to use technology to promote growth and reform institutions. That is the larger framework where we need to understand how the public utility is being reformed in Hyderabad. He wanted to use technology. Okay, so the first stage of reforms for the HMWS was to use computerization. E-Seva centers were set up. E-Seva centers are for people to use in order to pay for their bills online. Okay, and then there is a move to improve the board's customer service. You have the Metro Customer Care, Single Window Cell, Metro Women's Citizens Charter. They were all drawn up. They were all aimed at sprucing up the image of the HMWS to win public trust and support. So that when Naidu came into power the second time round, okay, he took it as a endorsement of these reforms that he's making. So when he came into power the second time round, he wanted to do more. The next stage of reforms. So what he did was he pushed for privatization of the board. Okay, when Naidu, but it failed in the early stages. There were strikes and protests organized in 2001 and 2002 by both opposition parties and trade unions. But not only that, but there were protests also from the HMWSSB's own employees and also from NGO groups. Okay, and Naidu also faced opposition from within his own party itself. Okay, so in June 2002, the board, the reform of the board, the privatization effort was actually stopped officially. Okay, now, so what happened there? Why did customer service reforms work, which is the first stage of reforms, but not the second one, privatization of the board? So what I would consider to be the case in the first instance why customer service reforms work is that that's the enabling effect of the social contract. Improving customer service is popular and entails little cost and pain to the people. You're not going to get people laid off. Board employees are not going to get laid off. Like what will happen if there is privatization? But there is also the constraining effect that prevented the privatization of the board. Naidu, this is a quote: "Allow the common man to at least retain his underwear." This person is the deputy speaker of this KCR, is actually within Naidu's party itself, Telugu Desam party, the TDP party. So you have Naidu actually have to face all these populist, this populism that is coming from its own party, his own people saying these kind of things. Okay, and socialism is a very important factor here. There's a very strong anti-privatization narrative in India, and it's not just in Hyderabad, but also in places like Delhi and all over India in general. And so Naidu was accused of surrendering Andhra Pradesh's economic sovereignty to World Bank. That is literally the words that have been used by his opposition and the media. And the rural bias, 93% of water in Andhra Pradesh is actually being used for the agriculture sector. 93%. Okay. Andhra Pradesh is a mostly rural population. So when Naidu tried to do all these things, the tough economic policies, tried to do things better in the urban water sector, he encountered all this opposition. So the Indian press said when he came back into power. So he came back. He lost an election in 2004. Okay, but he came back into power in 2014. Okay, when he came back into power, what the press said about him was the most important thing that the years in opposition taught Naidu was you could not get by with urbanization. You needed to have farmers on your side. What brought farmers back to the TDP, the Telugu Desam party, was Naidu's promise that he would waive farm loans. Populist ways of getting votes. Okay. So this is my last slide. What are the policy implications here? Can social contracts change? My point is that yes. Okay, but very slowly and under certain conditions. What are these conditions? I think you need someone who will champion the changes to the social contract. You need to look at political will. Okay. You also need to see whether the terms of the new or revised social contract actually fits well with the society and whether it has universal appeal. Also, how do we look at the futures of China and India in terms of public goods provision? I would say that in China's case, we see Jinping accumulating power for themselves, bypassing institutions, actually do not speak well for the functioning of the government in China in the longer run, if he continues to stay in power for a longer run. That might have spillover effects on public goods provision in the end, if institutions do not perform efficiently and goods are being used, and resources are being diverted to other things. And then for India, I don't come across as someone who's pro-China here, but as someone who looks at both countries in a fair manner. I think that there's a lot of strength in Indian democracy. You have countries, turning away from democracies, but India is still a bastion of democracy. In fact, they just had their elections. Okay, Indians vote with their feet. They will go long distances to voting booths because they love and treasure their votes. Because that's their voice, their only way to speak out against injustice and politicians that they do not like. Now, in democracies, there are a lot of democratic values that are in line with public goods provision. And I think that in India, that should be played up by politicians. And politicians must be willing to bite the bullet and deal with the difficulties that will come. In fact, face the possibility of losing elections if they try to carry out reforms that will help the economy to grow and help bring about public goods, even if they want to do away with populist types of things. Free water, free electricity, lots of subsidies is not the way to go forward in running an economy. And one of the things that they can do, India can do, is to pack the performance of officials, local officials, to their ability to engender growth in the localities that they serve, and in the way whether they're able to produce public goods in the areas that they serve. I think if you have a performance assessment that's based on that, that will really help the Indian case. Now, so what I just want to conclude by, what are the implications for the United States? I'm sure in 2015, all of you know about Flint, Michigan. What happened there and the water crisis? Well, as far as I know, as of now, they are trying to fix the problem, but they have not completed fixing the problem. They still need to build the pipes and all that. So, are we looking at a situation where public goods are actually breaking down in the United States? Let me go back to the social contract to try to explain this situation. I think that America is built on what I would call the lock-in social contract. I'm sure that Americans here will know that the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, is built on is lock-in, is built on the idea of lock, and the idea is that of a limited government. The role of government is to protect life, liberty, and property. And Americans give up a limited amount of their power, of their autonomy and sovereignty to the state in order for the state to protect having a limited role. Now, a limited role of government makes it really difficult for extensive provision of public goods. If you agree with those who say that if you have great GDP, you're wealthy, you should have high public goods, that doesn't seem to be the case here. So this again, strengthens my case that you actually need to look at what is the social contract. And I think that, again, there's lots of things that we can do in the local social contract that we can emphasize that will help this production of public goods. Law is actually very concerned about public goods, that there should be public goods. But the tension between that and limited government makes it really difficult. So I think that one way is to relook how these things are done within the American government and the American society. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you, Selina. You've really put some very interesting ideas and comparisons on the table between two big countries with very different systems and tried to elaborate this issue of social contract. We now have approximately 30 or so minutes for Q&A. So just remind people who came in the room late that we are on the record and live streaming. And I would ask you as you pose your question or make your comment, just to identify yourself, please, and then direct a question or comment to Selina. I saw your hand first, sir. Yes.
Okay, Stanley Cobra. Your argument seems to be a response to Amartya Sen's formulation that in a democracy you don't have famines. But I don't, my sense is the argument dealt with, extreme events like famines.
Right.
I noticed in your discussion of China, you didn't mention the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward.
Oh, yeah.
And my sense is for the generation that lived through that, maybe it's in your book, but you didn't mention it. I have noticed they look back to the Great Leap Forward, they will mention it and say, we don't want that again.
Yeah.
And I think that had a profound impact on them that may make China distinct. I mean, we've had famines in, for example, North Korea. So, that would be my question to you. Is China then a model because of this unique experience, which they now openly acknowledge? We don't want that again.
Okay, so I actually talk about Amartya Sen in my book. It's on the very first page. Okay. And I noted exactly what you said. Thank you, sir, for mentioning it. And I quoted him to say, it is not surprising that no famine has ever taken place in the history of the world in a functioning democracy, be it economically rich or relatively poor. And he said, so he went on to compare that. And I also talk about the Cultural Revolution in my book. I actually call it the ideological interregnum, meaning that from historical times, there has always been the idea of the mandate of heaven and a performance-based social contract between the state and society. But when Mao came into power, now he tried to change this social contract that is based on performance. Performance is still important, but it's not the main thing that he was concerned about. I call it an ideological-based social contract. He was driven by ideology, and therefore the idea of provision of public goods and all that was secondary, and that created the famine. So the way I put it in my book to explain the Mao period, the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, which so many people have died during that period of time, is to say that this is a blip, and it is a blip precisely because social contracts are actually tenacious, they are enduring, it's persistent and difficult to change. So when Mao tried to change it, there were huge consequences for his country. For his country, famine, number of people died, industrial production all went down, agricultural production all went down. There was tremendous implications for the party itself, the CCP. Okay, it lost, it lost its direction. It was fractured. It was fragmented. And then for the nation, for himself, Mao became an isolated figure when he emerged from that period of time. So this is exactly what I'm saying. When that a social contract is an informal institution, it constrains you. If you try to act against what is a social contract, you're going to have consequences. The consequences were dire for the Chinese nation when Mao did what he did, tried to get away from the performance-based social contract. The consequences were huge for the Chinese nation, for the CCP itself, and for Mao himself. So that's my explanation for that period of time.
Sir, with the hat, yes. Please.
My name is Yaya Fanusi with the United States of Africa 2017 Project Task Force. When I got the invitation, and I looked at it, I said, I don't need to come. It's obvious that it's not a regime system that makes a difference. And I'm here listening to you. You say social contract is an explanation for the variance. Don't you think it's more the fiscal capability of the two regimes, that they're not, you're comparing two different type of economic standard?
Right.
China is very wealthy compared to India. Would it have been better if you find another country at the same level to do the explanation?
In fact,
remember this, let me know, when I was doing my studies in America in 1967 until up to my PhD level, my professors, any professor who is giving a course as soon as they see my name, they'll mention, oh, you're the Yaya Fanusi, I'm prepared for you. Because I'm always coming with a different approach to what they're saying.
Right. You also mentioned the Gulf monarchies, but you mentioned monarchies, but also resources in the same breath, which struck me as that the question the gentleman raises about the wherewithal rather than just the political or social contract.
Right. So I actually account for this, the level of economic development. We're talking about wealth here, right? Among the fiscal ability of these countries, right? So resources do play a part. I don't disagree that wealth will make it easier for governments to produce more public goods. Now, let me do Satu first because this one is easier. The Gulf monarchies have resources, which change the incentives, right? But the issue here is this: the Gulf monarchies, if they are not guided by a certain ethos, by a certain way of behavior, by a code of behavior, they could easily have not redistributed. They could have accumulated rents for themselves. What makes them want to redistribute? So my answer to this gentleman is exactly the same. So levels of wealth, yes, very important, right? But there has to be a reason why countries want. There must be a motivation for governments to want to redistribute. What is the reason for governments want to redistribute? What is the reason why? That level is that even if you have high economic ability, why is it that there are some states with higher levels of public goods and there are still some with lower levels of public goods? So what I'm saying is that there's no direct causal linkage. You cannot presume that because you're wealthy and therefore you will give. It's like philanthropists, right? If you're a rich businessman, not every rich businessman is a philanthropist. What drives this desire to want to redistribute? You can a wealthy country could be you could actually have what could actually happen is that the elites could accumulate for themselves.
But it's your theoretical approach. What I'm saying is that your subject matter. Okay.
Right.
I used to be a professor in political economy and public management. So I know how important it is for fiscal capacities.
Yes.
Very important.
Right.
So what I'm saying is that your primary focus, to me, is not the conceptual approach that you should have taken. Because you need to compare to explain a variation that certain things should be comparable.
Right. So I'm not saying, I don't think of China and India as completely uncomparable. In fact, there are a lot of comparative work that's being done on China and India. Right? I acknowledge the differences in the economy and the levels of, the way they do things. Their fiscal capacity is one thing for sure. But it is not, it is not possible to control for everything that is exactly the same. Well, so what I did was this. I took 4 cities, and I compared across 4 cities, 2 in China and 2 in India. I took what is known as the most similar case comparison, in terms of that they are cities with the highest economic growth. They are water scarce cities, and that they are important political economic centers. So I think it's impossible to say to compare everything exactly to be the same. But this is most similar already as I could get. But let me give you another argument, against this level of economic development. Now, if you were to, like the country that I'm from, Singapore, in terms of HDI, it ranks amongst the top ranks. It's a very small economy. It is wealthy economy, but it's a small economy. GDP itself is small. But if you go by GDP, the United States is the largest. In the HDI ranking, it is the 10th. Singapore ranks higher than America on the HDI. So that tells you that wealth does not explain everything.
That's not what I'm saying.
Yes, I agree with you, and I try to explain.
Government, I work for the state government of California for 30 years, so I know about fiscal because
I want to move to other folks so they get a chance.
Yeah.
Steve Winters was next, and then we'll go to Mike Massatic.
I wanted to just focus on a very short remark you made about Xi Jinping, and I think you expressed something that you hear here in DC quite frequently, that it's worrisome that he's bypassing institutions, and this might have a bad effect on China. Now, although it's popular to say that, and then some examples are, they say, well, instead of having a collective rule by the Politburo, now you have, in essence, one strong man with powers that aren't bound by some collective decisions. Okay, very popular to say. However, so the question is, couldn't one, instead of interpreting what's going on as bypassing institutions, interpret it as replacing institutions, strong institutions, with other institutions which are equally strong or maybe even stronger? For instance, there's a revision that he carried forth of the military commission, a massive revision, but it was done for a purpose, and it's certainly not a weaker military commission now, probably more agile in certain ways. And then the comparison to the US would be that, you probably don't follow all this stuff, but the Goldwater-Nichols forcible revision of the whole structure of the US military. Okay, it totally bypassed the previous organization, but the organization that it put in place, most people think is a better organization, stronger, and the military is more able to carry out its task. So I'm just saying, can you actually show any? I mean, it's not like Xi Jinping went down to Shenzhen and trashed the water supply or something. Can you actually give an example of where he's bypassed an institution and then created something that's much worse in its place?
Well, I think that one of the key institutions that has been replaced, bypassed, is actually the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Under the CCP regime, the MOFA is just an implementer. It doesn't really have a lot of inputs in policies, in foreign policy making. I think that's one key factor. But I don't disagree with this gentleman entirely. The Xi Jinping actually created a set of new institutions. The thing about these sets of institutions are they're actually beholden to him. That's the danger, right? Whether they are stronger or not stronger, the fact that it is personalized rule here, that it's beholden to him, he's the one who's in control, means that institutional safeguards are not necessarily there. These institutions will reflect his wishes, right? Rather than that of what generally will be good for China. I think that is the concern. And we actually need more time for how this situation actually plays out.
Yeah, and I wouldn't compare Goldwater-Nichols because it was passed by an elected Congress through due deliberation of the input of the American public, which voted for these members. It's
and
quite different.
Against the will of the military. But we'll leave that aside.
Well, under civilian control of the military, that speaks to probably the right way to proceed with reform.
Some people weren't happy.
Right.
You've done an interesting job of laying out how.
Introduce yourself, man.
Oh, sorry, Mike Massetti, journalist. Interesting job of laying out how China has dealt with these issues in terms of its current pressing needs and situation, urbanization, industrialization. I don't know how much you got into, and maybe vis-a-vis India or not, how much they're doing in terms of preparing for the future, because you could argue that a lot of what they're doing currently is going to really drastically affect their water supply in the future. Coal-based industrialization threatens the Himalayan ice cap. And if that goes, China runs a serious risk of going dry. All these dams up and down every river, what's the longer term effect of that going to be? Because I think, I'm not a water expert by any means, that China runs a greater risk of future water shortage than India does. I may be wrong on that, but that's my impression. So to what extent does China's system, for better or for worse, take into account these future risks in terms rather than dealing just with the present?
Yeah. So I'm sure that you've heard of Xi Jinping's new phrase, right? Ecological civilization, right? The idea, what China is trying to do now, I mean, it's becoming very much aware of the environmental impact of their industries, coal. So they have actually turned to things like renewable energy. The thing about renewable energy is like if it stems, there are certain effects on the environment as well, right? So, but I cannot give you a definite answer on exactly how they're doing now because I don't think that many people are able to assess that at this point. But what I can say is that the Chinese leadership is very much aware of this problem, of this problem of sustainable growth. Water problems will shave off China's GDP by as much as 1 to 2% in the next few years. So what?
Next how many years?
Next few years.
Oh.
1 to 2% in the next few years. I can give you the exact number in a second in my book. It's actually in my book. I can't remember the number offhand. But there is significant impact of water issues, water scarcity, pollution, and all that. So what the Chinese leadership is trying to do now is to create the idea, and the rallying call is the idea of an ecological civilization. It's a rallying call for the entire country to come together to try and deal with these environmental problems. So if you talk about NGOs in China, environmental groups are the ones who are actually among the most active. Primarily because the Chinese government allows space for them to act within that sphere of ecology, of environment, in order to drive an agenda which they actually agree with. So I think I don't really know how they are doing right at this point, but they are certainly making efforts in this sphere, and they are very much aware of the problems that are related to this.
Because I think technical. Rivi and then the young lady on the left there. Please, Rivi first.
So my name is Rivi Eisenberg. I'm actually here at the East-West Center in Washington. I was really interested by your point about the role of privatization in providing potentially more successful public goods. And I just thought it was interesting because it seems both China and the United States have this component of privatization that India might be lacking because of potentially the social contract or the regime. And I'm curious what you see the role of the regimes maybe in influencing the privatization.
The Indian government or which regions?
So I guess I'm wondering, is privatization of these public goods an effect of the social contract or the role of the regime?
Okay, so my argument is the social contract explains some of these policies that have come out, right? So privatization in the Chinese actually use a lot of privatization, as you noted, in public goods provision. India, there's this very strong anti-privatization narrative. They hate the World Bank in there. They think the World Bank as taking away India's economic sovereignty. Okay, so privatization. I just want to be clear about privatization, which I also mentioned in my book. There are people who are against privatization because they think that privatization means less accountability, and especially in terms of public goods. Because if you privatize public goods, it means that you're going to leave out. It can potentially make water tariffs very high. So one of the reasons why the Indian population is against privatization is they have the impression that water prices are going to skyrocket. So to be very clear, privatization is not the answer to everything. But privatization with strong government oversight, with rules and regulations in place, a strong legal framework actually helps and can actually help to solve some of the resource problems that governments have when it comes to providing public goods. So I just want to make that point clear. I'm not sure whether I've actually answered your question.
Yeah, actually I was just going with, obviously you need the government oversight with the privatization, but I was just curious that it seemed like both China and the US having very different regimes
and
have that component of
privatization. Yeah, agree. So regimes again, do not dictate the policies that come out.
Yes, Miss.
Hi, Willow Darcy with the Aspen Institute. Thanks for a really interesting talk. And I was just hoping to ask you if you could drill down a little bit on your learnings around the social contract in each national context, specifically around the private sector and its role and the trends potentially leaning toward the private sector providing public goods in both India and China, along with other kinds of hybrid players in the social innovation space, please.
Okay. So when I talk about the social contract, I do not have a universal social contract. right? I mean, I think that's clear. The Chinese have their own performance-based social contract, with the Indians having a populist socialist kind of social contract. And so you have other types of social contract too. You have the lock-in social contract, which is the American style one. You have the elite-based social contract, where in many African countries, where it's a where the state is elite-based, and resources are being accrued, being capped by the elites. Public goods provision is low, and there are many other types of social contracts that you can think of, which I kind of mentioned at the end of the book. It's like a typology of social contracts. So the role of the private sector varies according to what these social contracts dictate when it comes to public goods, right? So in my case, I'm saying that in China's case, the larger picture here is that the performance-based social contract means that it will institute whatever policies that is needed for it to keep that performance-based social contract. It's agreement with society. Even if that means that even though it's a socialist country, it's supposed to be socialism with Chinese characteristics, but they will actually embrace privatization when necessary. So, but if you're talking about the trend for private sectors, privatization of water in the water sector worldwide. Okay, so that's the theoretical part of it. But if you're talking about whether privatization trends worldwide, right, on water, I think that's actually something that has been debated. In China, it's like going skyrocket. It happens. It is, in fact, I have some data here which I could share with you, which I can't remember offhand right now. But basically, the idea is that in East Asian countries, the number of privatized water companies that actually are mostly from China. While in India, in a period of, 10 years or so, you have only one privatization. The privatization experience in India hasn't worked out very well. I'm not sure whether I'm actually answering your question.
Sure. I was actually more interested about other kinds of social safety nets that private companies might be offering. So less specific to the water sector and privatization in the sector, which is nonetheless interesting to hear your thoughts on. But I'm thinking actually more generally around as firms grow in size and capacity, and their relationship with customers and society is changing. Have you come across any ideas that you think would be relevant to share on that point? So it's rather peripheral, but you've got some interesting research that might speak to that.
So maybe I can talk a little bit about how social insurance and social safety net is being set up in China. The private sector actually doesn't have a very good role when it comes to medical insurance or a social safety net in terms of pensions and other forms of benefits. It's actually provided by, it used to be provided by companies, the state sector. Right? That's when, cradle to grave kind of benefits from the state sector. So when the state sector was partially dismantled, was SOE reforms in the late 1990s. It created a whole slew of problems for China, and they're not able to provide for the large numbers of laid-off workers, because if you don't have work now, you have no benefits at all. So what local governments very cleverly do is that they actually use so like in the area of pension reforms, they actually work with private companies actually to provide pension reform from certain sectors of from these groups of people who have actually been laid off. Okay. Now, for a much more detailed work about this, I will refer you to Mark Fraser's book. Mark Fraser, have you read it before? I'm not sure.
No.
But he did an excellent study on pension reform and how that actually, because of the way the government is using the private sector, actually lead to huge inequalities. I'm not talking about private insurance here, but leveraging on the private sector to provide the funds for pensions actually led to huge inequalities in China. So that's worth taking a look. Mark Fraser on pensions.
Yes, sir. Yes, please.
Ian Reiner. I do research. I also went to LKY, graduated from there.
One of our students.
Great.
I just wondered if you factored in, I hate asking questions about books I haven't read, but did you factor in land reform in your explanation for the differences between the two countries? I remember reading, I think, in The Economist, supposed to be a Banyan column, there was a theory going around that one of the major differences when it came to development was really the breakage and reformation of land patronage networks, which occurred in Japan and South Korea and in China, but didn't occur in larger parts of Southeast Asia, and therefore there's a trend with the ones where they did break up patronage networks and align incentives with farmers to actually be responsible for their own produce and therefore directly benefit from it. And when this happened, this accelerated development quite quickly, whereas this hasn't happened in democracies such as the Philippines. And I was wondering whether that was taken into account for India. I don't really know Indian history very well. I briefly looked up land reform in India, and I saw that largely under their system, it seems like it's still administered and sort of controlled by government institutions. And I know that there's been a lot of problems in Indian markets trying to directly link the amount that Indian farmers produce with what they actually get in terms of income. Obviously, with agriculture, a lot of it is about information and getting things directly to market quickly, whereas China succeeded in doing that. So the argument might be then, it's not so much whether it's an authoritarian government or a democracy, but did this government, because obviously South Korea and Japan are not democracies, but did this government have the good luck or / terrible misfortune of having an event that caused them to redistribute their land from the old patronage networks into a new one?
So let me say a few things. First is that I'm not an expert on rural agriculture reforms, so I can only tell you what I've read. Okay, it's not part of the book, but one of the things that have been noted by scholars of public goods and land reforms is that one of these authors will be. I'll give you the name in a bit. But he actually wrote that land reforms actually work better under dictatorships. They actually work better under dictatorships. Basically, in democracies, because these groups become captured by, they have to look out for the interests of their constituencies on the ground. It was really difficult for them to break up the land holdings. And this is, I think, what happened in India. The traditional patronage networks make it very difficult for land reforms to come about. So you're right, democracies, it's really difficult for land reforms to work, but it actually works really well with dictatorships.
Well, fair enough.
Let me get the name of the.
In the meantime, while you're thinking about it, because we're almost just a couple of minutes, just a couple of thoughts. An Indian colleague of mine who's a political philosopher, sort of political scientist, that used to always say, kind of informally, I don't want to put words into his mouth, but essentially something like, China's social contract depends on delivery of public goods because failure to do so could not just lose elections, but lose power and lose your head.
Yeah.
In India, politicians lose elections.
Yeah.
So the incentive structure for social contract is, on the one hand, less incentive to produce results, and on the other, less consequential not to produce results.
Yeah.
In China, it's, if you don't, it's not just, you're not coming back for 2 years.
Yeah.
You're not going to be around at all.
Yeah.
And it's a system. So in a way, resiliency is about the resiliency of the fragility of the Chinese system explains good provision of public goods. Whereas the Indian structure can absorb a heck of a lot of inefficiencies. And that's where I think you didn't touch on, but I think issues of culture and civilization might play a role. I don't know enough about it, but certainly. And the other thing that struck me about it is, if there is a social contract, this mandate of heaven issue, that should be applicable across all areas. And like all public goods in all countries, China's too is uneven. So you have health scares, food scares, vaccination scares. So there has to be some, the example of water may be one, but it may not be applicable across all elements of Chinese provision. So just two things that came to my mind as I was thinking through your arguments that may be worthwhile.
Sure. I mean, I take in the point on the first one. On the second one, my response is that that's exactly my point. I mean, the mandatory improvement is important when it comes to, and then it's tied into performance. And I note right from the beginning that we're not talking about China being perfect.
Of course.
There's no country that's perfect in providing public goods. And you'll find that in areas like benefits and all that, those are tied in very much actually with regime survival. And you'll find that the Chinese government is actually trying all sorts of methods to resolve that. And I see it as work in progress. So we don't know the real result yet. But from the beginning, when the CCP came into power, it was a cradle to grave benefit system. This is how much importance social public goods is important to them. So this is about the changes, the transition as the SOEs get dismantled. What is the resulting social network? The Chinese government has not given up on trying to deal with it. They are still dealing with it.
Good, you had the citation for it.
Michael Albertus, he actually worked on land reforms in Latin America.
Can you spell Albert?
Albertus.
So I'm sorry, we have to close sharply. Afterwards, Professor Ho may be around for a little bit and she can address your questions offline, but I'm afraid the formal time we have to close because we are, as I said, on video, and I know we have, many of us have other things that we need to get onto, but I just wanted to say thank you all for joining, and particularly I want to congratulate Selina again on her book.
Thank you.
Thank you for the second time that you've come to the East-West Center to present your work. I've very much enjoyed over the years. I first got to know Selina when her work on rivers, on transboundary rivers.
I'm still working on it.
And still working on that area. And so I've really enjoyed learning from you on your scholarship and congratulate you on the new book and hope you'll come back on your new book, which is listed in her biography, which also sounds very, very interesting about iron rivers and railroad, rivers of iron, about railroad networks that China is building in the region as part of BRI. So we welcome you again. Thank you, Selina.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Satu, and this is my copy of the book.
Thank you so much. Please, thank you.